So my name, as Uma said, is Suzanne Duncanson-Hunter, and I'm the Senior Manager for Research in the faculty, and I manage and support the sort of the research bidding process within the faculty, and I'll introduce the names of the team a bit later. I thought it would be helpful to kind of outline our general idea for this session. So the first half, we're just going to have a look at where to start. So that will just be a very brief outline because we're kind of aware that maybe people are quite experienced bidders. And then I will introduce the team and how we support people within FAS. And then we're going to look at 3 funders, which hopefully sort of sit within SSGS and this festival, which is ESRC, AHRC and EU. And then we're going to pass over to Simon, who's very kindly going to talk about his experience. And I think we're going to sort of have half an hour where we're a bit more fluid. And if there's more questions, Umit or Agnes or other people who've experienced bidding can sort of help answer questions. So we'll have sort of a half hour, quite more fluid part of the presentation. And then Simon, as I said, has to leave at 1. And then we'll look at 3 other funders, which I sort of feel appropriate to this kind of academics present, which is the British Academy Wellcome and Leverhulme. And then I was going to do a demonstration of Research Professional, which is an online search tool for funders, but we can make a decision nearer the time if people feel that's helpful. If you're an experienced, if most people are experienced, maybe that won't be helpful. So we can be a bit flexible, but hopefully that gives you an outline of what we're hoping to achieve during the session. So I think Umit or Lisa is going to very kindly just let me know if there are any questions. So do ask, but we have a very specific time after Simon's talked as well, in case I don't answer any questions as we go along. So just sort of where do you start with bidding? So I think these are sort of questions to ask. So obviously, where am I in my research career? So most funders have some kind of specific funding for early career researchers. And each funding body has a different definition of early career. So you definitely need to look at the funders. Some say 2 years, some are up to 7 years. The ESRC now doesn't actually have a number of years. You've kind of just got to outline in your application why you can consider yourself to be an early career researcher. And then what is your bidding experience? Because you might actually be a very experienced researcher, but you've been able to do a lot of your research without bidding, so you're quite early in your bidding experience. And the general rule, although I think when Simon does his presentation, he'll say that didn't quite happen in his experience, is we encourage people to start smaller, more niche funders. That just gives you opportunity to kind of learn both the OU process, but also, you know, how to write proposals. It gives you experience of actually running a project, and that helps when you're applying for larger ones, because you can say, well, I've already received this funding, I can demonstrate that I can get external income and I can manage a project and I can achieve the outputs that I said I would. But as that doesn't always happen, especially within SSGS, because sometimes you're working on something which is very topical, and suddenly there's an amazing pot of money which just fits exactly what you're doing. So you do sometimes just have to respond and just go with it. And if you have got a group of people around you, you might just have to dive in at the deeper end. But as a general rule, it's better to start smaller and grow, because then you can demonstrate that you've got a track record. And what am I wanting funding for? So some funders are much more about the individual and fellowship. So do you want, actually, the main thing you want is your time bought out in order to produce research outputs? Or is it, I want to do partnership work and work with a variety of people doing a whole range of different activities? And so it might be more knowledge exchange and impact rather than pure research, or it might be quite a collaborative piece of research. And then one thing which I think is really important, can sometimes forget is actually, what does the funder want? All funders are there for a purpose. They've got their own objectives that they've got to meet. So I would always encourage you, and I outline it on here, what is that funder saying their funding is about? What, especially if they're trusts and foundations, they will have this funding for a very specific reason. So you need to ensure that what you're wanting to do fits with what they want. Otherwise, you're going to not have as much chance of getting the funding, or not get the funding at all. And then lastly, it does take a lot of time, and you put a lot of energy into putting a bid together, but unfortunately the success rates aren't high. So there is a likelihood that you won't be successful, and that is really challenging, and it can be really disappointing. But what we'll also say and keep saying is that once you've got over that initial shock, it's always worth talking to colleagues and coming back to us and kind of going, what, is there a different pot of funding I could go for? Or could I use some of my research to work with other people in a bigger bid? Or can I change it slightly and apply to a different funders? So if you're not successful the first time, that isn't the end of the story. There's often other ways of being repurposing it or looking at different funders. So those are kind of things to consider when thinking about, well, I want to apply for funding, who should I apply for and what should I apply for? So just to introduce what we do in the team, in case you're not aware. So we're here to help you identify funders. So that's very much what I will do, and I'm very happy always to meet with people one-to-one, and you could kind of go, oh, this is what I'm thinking, what would you advise, and which direction would you suggest I go in? And then we ask that you let us know as soon as possible when you're bidding. Bidding can take a considerable amount of time, and then we allocate a research manager, and in the main that is then the person that will support you through the whole process. If it's a particularly large bid, we're now trying to put 2 research managers on to provide some more support. Those research managers are really brilliant at knowing what the terms and conditions are of that particular funder and how it works and the submission portal, and will sort of really help and guide you on all of those elements. And they also work with you in preparing the budget and making sure that you're applying for money that you're allowed to, and don't apply for things that the funder won't particularly allow. And we do have a research library, and we're always happy to sort of signpost people if we have examples of successful bids to that funder or to that call, to pass on to you for you to kind of be able to look. There is always an internal approval process, and that is true whether you're leading on the project or if you're a co-I with another institution. If the OU is receiving any money, then we need to go through the internal process, because we have to make sure that finance and everybody is aware. And also, if you get AHRC and ESRC often will provide feedback. Some schemes and some funders have an interview. So if you get that far, then we're there to support and direct you. We work with RES, and they can often do a mock interview if that's helpful and useful to you. And we could give some advice on the feedback from reviewers, but we would always encourage you also to talk to colleagues. But I'll say a bit more about that later on. And then hopefully, if you're successful, then we support you in setting up the project, making sure that the legal contracts are signed with the funders and with your partners if you're involved. But it's mainly a very broad support in the sense that it's between to support you with the funder. We can't unfortunately offer project management, and so that needs to be considered if you need to write that into a bid. And as I said, if you're unsuccessful, then I'm happy to meet with you to sort of talk about and see how we can either repurpose it or if there's other funders that you can apply to. So as I said, I'm over the team, and the 4 other people in the team, Charlotte and Wendy, who are part-time, and then Atalanta and Kirsty. So you would have one of those people supporting you. And so this is the kind of internal process which I thought is helpful for people to kind of see how it works. So as I said, we ask that you let us know, and that there's a generic email address. And then we have an internal system where we do all the costings and we put all the documents, called AMS. So we ask that you go and set up a record there. As I said, the research managers will help you with the bid. And then our legal team have to look at the terms and conditions, and any other part, and will ask you to ensure that you are happy with those. And we also need the partners to agree if you're working with partners. And then there is also ethics and risk and benefits that need to be considered. We generally always encourage people to get a peer review within your department or school. But if you haven't bid before, then we request that you do, or if it's a larger bid over 50,000, and we'll support that process. With peer reviewers, we generally advise and found useful if you have somebody within your discipline who understands what you're wanting to do. But quite often it's also a second person who's maybe outside of that, who can give a more broader context. Because for a lot of funders, it's not going to be a specialist who looks at the at your research proposal. So it's sometimes helpful to have somebody else sort of say, that's not so clear to me as a non-specialist. And then if you're working with partners, we have to do a due diligence process. So that's just our finance people and our legal people need to look at the partners to make sure that if successful, they will actually be able to carry out the activity, and that we know how we're going to pay them, and money's going to get transferred. And if we need details from the partners, then generally the research manager will liaise with that partner in getting the financial details, or if there's any other legal documentation required, they will liaise for you on behalf of you with the partners. And then when it's all submitted, this is the actual, what we call approval process. So this is the internal bit. So that's just to sort of demonstrate that actually it generally takes 10 working days from the time you've actually completed your application to getting OU approval, because it needs to go to head of school, and then it needs to go to our central research support. Then our finance people need to look at it, and then it goes to Rose before it's actually submitted. And the submission sometimes is yourself directly in the portal. Sometimes it's actually our central res who have to submit a button within the funder portal. And we always encourage people, it does take time, and it's worth ensuring you have enough time to put a project together. In the main, sort of 10 to 12 weeks for a project. If it's involving a lot more partners, then it's much longer, because there's just so much more liaison, and generally, as the lead, need time to be able to talk with those partners about what they're doing and what they can do and how they want to do it. And we would encourage to give yourself that much time, because it is very competitive, and you want to ensure that you put the best bid in, because you don't do lots of work and then not give yourself the best chance. So we're just going to now look at EU funding before I pass over to Simon, who will talk about his experience, and to sort of just give updates on EU funding. Oh, no. Oh, that my PowerPoint has not gone the way it should have gone. I don't know if people have been aware, but there's been a lot of discussions between the UK government and EU funding. So we still haven't had an official agreement on what we're going to do and how we're going to, what kind of relationship we're going to have with the EU and Horizon 20 funding. But the basic outcome is that we can't lead any funding that is EU funded, where it's a collaboration. the one exception is the European Research Council, ESR, which I'll just talk about later, and that's because you as an individual apply, it's not a consortium. So we can't apply as leads in consortiums, so therefore we need to look for partnerships and to look for opportunities to be work with others who will lead. But if we are in a partnership and that bid is successful, then the UK government will provide 100% of whatever was put into the bid that the EU said they would give us. And then there's another process that has to be followed in order to get that, but I'm not going to go into that detail. So my main advice is, if you're interested in EU funding, because there are so many different calls and because we can't lead, I would say to come and talk to me, or to me and Helen, who knows a lot about EU funding. She is in the Central Research and Enterprise Support team, and we can just go with you. And Helen is really good as well. It's sort of saying, okay, this is the area you're interested in. Let's do some horizon scanning to see what particular pots of funding might fit what you want to do. And then we can also support you with looking for appropriate partners if you need that. So the one exception is you can apply to, because it's not really about a partnership or consortium. So I know you can't see most of that detail, so that's just there because these slides will be sent around for your reference, so you have it for later. But there's three main categories. There is somebody who's just starting, so the EU's concept of early career is 2 to 7 years from your PhD. The projects are up to 5 years, and there's 1.5 million available. And in the main, the lead, the PI, the applicant is expected to spend at least 50% of their time on this project, whatever the project is. And then there's sort of mid-career, or what they call consolidator grants, 7 to 12 years, and it's then slightly more, 2 million, again, 5 years. And because you're mid-career, you're not expected to spend as much time, but at least 40% of your time needs to be on the project that you're asking for. And then there's the advanced, which is when you're 10 years plus, and it's 2.5 million. And again, it's less time because it's recognized as a senior researcher. You will have other responsibilities. And then at the bottom, there's the general deadlines. And so normally the early comes in July, and then the deadline is September. These ones are a bit longer. So that's just for future reference. So I'm now going to stop sharing and pass over to Simon. But before I do, is there any questions in the chat? No. Okay. So Simon, I shall pass over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Suzanne, and apologies again for having to leave at 1, but I have to give evidence to the Welsh Parliament, which is the only reason I'm wearing the tie, with all due respect to colleagues. I just want to kind of share some experience. So I've been at the Open University for just over 2 years now, but during my career, I've had a number of grants from the ESRC, and I've just finished a European Horizon project, which was 3 years in running. So I just want to kind of share some thoughts, and a lot of it actually is what Suzanne says, and I think probably for me the starting point is to not do this alone. And I think this is often where, I know when I started out, I kind of took it on myself that this is just a thing I had to work out and get on top of. And I see that often with colleagues starting out in their career. The kind of support you get from Suzanne and colleagues, from the university more generally, from people in your department, is super useful, and it makes the process much more manageable, much more accessible, and it improves your chances of success. And I think that this is one of the things that often we kind of take a slightly masochistic approach of trying to do things and work them out and try and second guess what there is, rather than actually just asking people. And so one of the people I think it's always useful to ask is, if you've got a query about a call that's out there, if there's a contact person, then contact them. And that's particularly true for calls that are specific calls. So typically you get general calls, which are just, we've got this kind of amount of size of money, like those ERC grants that Suzanne was just talking about, which are for any subject. And then you get specific calls where typically there will be somebody who is responsible for managing that. And so we've seen in recent years a lot of those kind of things. A lot of European funding is like that. A lot of UKRI calls are like that too. So in my case, my fellowships have come from calls which relate to the endless gift of Brexit. There was somebody who was in charge of that. I spoke with them just to kind of get a sense of what it was they were looking for and see whether my ideas as they stood at that point fitted with what they were looking for. And that's, I think, maybe the next seemingly quite obvious point, but something which again I think is really essential, which is, as Suzanne said, funders are looking for something. So you need to be very clear, not just about what your project is, why it's good in its own terms, but why it's good for the funder. So being very clear and explicit and systematic about how you meet the criteria that are being set out in the call. So typically there will be a list of topics and a list of points that they say that they will be judging you on. So make sure you use that language again in your application just to mirror that back, because at some point what's happening is those applications are going to a panel of reviewers, so people like you and me. You have a big pile of things, and they've got a grid they've got to fill, and they've got to put marks against it out of 5 or 10 or whatever. And the easier you can make that for them to see, okay, on this criterion they've talked about this and that they can actually judge you, is something which is surprisingly rare. And in the events occasions where I've done reviewing, often you're kind of searching around for some sense that maybe there's an answer which could be constructed by extrapolation from what you've been given, rather than the ones that just work through it very clearly. So make it easy for the funder to see the value and how you meet the criteria that are given to you. And I think, that then kind of feeds into, I think, the second thing that I'd say, which is think about learning from failing. I've certainly failed in various bids over the years. And actually, to pick up on Suzanne's point, one of the very first bids I did was as PI on a big European grant, which was 3 million euros. And it had, I think we ended up with about 8 or 9 partners across Europe. Now, in retrospect, that was a stupid move. But at the same time, I learned something useful from it, partly never to be a PI on a big consortium bid, because that's a massive amount of commitment and coordination. But the reason I went for that at that time was that there was a call which was very close to my research interests. I had some ideas which I've been throwing around more generally. And really importantly, I had a network of people who I could bring together in short order. So in those kind of situations, I know we kind of say, start small, start with what you're comfortable with, but then work up to bigger things. Actually, sometimes bigger things come round, not at the point that they fit into the nice kind of ski jump kind of approach that we talk about. So if there are opportunities there, if you see a call that's out there that is your call, then definitely go for it. Talk to the people in your department, your research director, talk to the people in the faculty in the university, and make the most of moving that forward, because those opportunities don't always come around. Maybe as a flip side to that, as just a thought, one of the things that I hear from funders and from colleagues is that sometimes when you get a very topical issue coming through and you get calls for that very topical issue, you get everybody applying for it. So the one that I'm sure you will remember is COVID. There were a number of calls that were out there, and funders were flooded with everybody's project with a little bit of a COVID twist. And certainly we had it before with Brexit as well, where suddenly everyone's research had some kind of Brexit dimension. And what I was hearing from funders was that actually there was vast oversubscribing to those specific calls, and many of the things that were being rated as decent pieces of research, viable projects to be funded, couldn't be funded because A, there was not enough money in the call, but B, they had been sort of somewhat denatured by that attempt to kind of fit the call's brief. And if those applications had gone into general and open calls, then they would have had a much better chance of being successful. So whilst it's good to kind of think about what's out there, don't let that try and draw you away from what might be the best venue for your funding. And again, talking to people, I think, is really essential in that. So as a final piece of reflection, I think one of the key things is think about your timelines. Everything takes somewhat longer than you think it does. And certainly in previous institutions, and I can't speak to here, so I'm going to take a wild guess if it's the case, don't be the person who says, I've got a deadline tomorrow, please help me and sort out all my problems, to the research support office that you have and the people that you've got attached to you. If they've got a deadline, then they've got a deadline for a reason. It's not that they just want to slow things down, it's that they've got a lot of other bids that are there. They may have a lot of other people applying for the same call that you're applying for. The more you can help them to help you, again, the better the quality of support you'll get in terms of developing and optimizing your application. So being ready in advance for deadlines, thinking about projects that you might want to fund, even if you don't at that point have a specific funder in mind, is really useful because it means you need less time to develop your ideas up to a state where they're in a submittable form, because you've already kind of done the intellectualizing and the kind of thinking about how it works and the activities that are attached. So at the point that an opportunity comes, you can slot yourself in more efficiently into that process. So talk to people early, talk to people often. If there are delays, then let people know, see how you can work things out. And in so doing, I think you get something really that gives you the best chance of being successful. And if it's not successful, try again. Just as if you have an article rejected by a journal, for example, or a book proposal by a publisher, it's not that you throw it all away. It's that you think about the feedback you've got, think about alternative places you can go, rework things and submit again. And I'd say it's exactly the same for research bids. Certainly with colleagues here, we've had a number of successful things that have been resubmissions and reformulations. If you're getting to the point where maybe after 3 rejections, you're getting a bit short of ideas, then I think you'd probably be thinking about, is this actually going to happen? Or you just put it on the shelf. But still, think about how you can work through that. And, then I think when you are successful, do a good job, meet your obligations, stick to your timelines as much as you can, and as circumstances permit. And then that sets you up well for the next stage of what comes. And certainly once you have some funding, it becomes easier for you to make an argument about, why you need more funding, which is why we think about that kind of snowballing effect. Anyway, I'm going to stop there because there are lots of different points in that, but I'm really happy to take questions, thoughts, and, develop it further.
Has anybody got any questions? I'm going to try and do the normal thing of look at the chat and see if anybody's got hands up.
We haven't got anyone in the chat. That's because I think between
that's
the two of us, we have
we've covered
masterfully
everything,
we've covered everything.
And I can't see anybody with their hands up. I don't know, Umit or Agnes or others, if they want to kind of add things that they feel might be useful, maybe also sort of having run a project, especially at the OU. Are there things that you would advise to think about at pre-award while applying?
Hi. So mine will be more of a question, actually, if for both of you to expand on, perhaps, and also perhaps a very brief question to people who are here, participants, as to what their level of experience is and what kind of input or so they would appreciate. So, you know, we can say absolute beginners who've never done any bidding, or people who've done maybe a couple of bids but who'd like to know how to um, you know, further tips. So I think that would be really, really helpful for both Suzanne and Simon and other colleagues. So my question will be to the both of you, if you can expand on and perhaps give us some examples as well on what can go wrong and what can go right when you're looking for partners. And, you know, so what can go wrong and how to overcome it. Sorry, that's what I should have said, right? What can be the challenges? Because I think very often the devil is in the detail, and it was super helpful to hear both of you giving a really good overview, I think, of the processes. But yeah, so yeah, that would be one question I think that could be of interest to colleagues.
Simon, are you happy to
Yeah,
sort of...
I'm happy to start with that. I'm going to take it, actually, you said two questions. So, you know, the very first time you apply, you know, is a daunting kind of thing. So three kind of thoughts. First one is internal funding. You know, our internal funding processes are less demanding on you in terms of the paperwork and the kind of the procedural side of it, but you know, it still captures the key thing, which is about coming up with a compelling idea. And I think often, you know, that's at the heart of any research proposal, is that you have an idea that has value, that makes people want to support it. And I think, you know, that just even on the various funds we've got internally, you know, just think about open societal challenges when we've had that, you know, that process wasn't a difficult process in terms of what you had to produce, but you had to think carefully about what there is. So I think that's one point, is start with some internal funding. Also, secondly, study associations. Your study association might well have some small pots of money for organising events or networks. Something like that is easy. Again, it typically is not as competitive. And that's really good, because that feeds into the third thing, which is your second question, which is about partners. That organising events and setting up networks where you get some money for it not only gives you some experience of applying for money, it also helps you to meet people. And I think when you're thinking about larger bids, which you're doing collaboratively, then having partners is really helpful. Now, you know, you might think about that in different ways. One of the thing might be that somebody else with more experience leads on a bigger bid, and then you're a co-investigator, and that means you don't have to do the heavy lifting on the paperwork, but you get an insight into how they've managed it. And certainly if I think about my European funding experience, and I've been involved in a couple of bids and one successful project and one PI, yes, the quality of the PI matters. You know, if you have confidence that the PI is the kind of person who is on top of everything, then that is a massive bonus. You know, you will know that from knowing them and how they are generally. You know, I think people have a pretty good sense of how people are. So it's not enough for them to be a big presence or to be, you know, famous. It's, you know, will they actually be on top of the kind of management? It's a bit like co-authors for outputs. You know, there are some people you've worked with who you would happily work with again and again and again, and there are some people who you are never going to work with again on writing something, because it just doesn't work. And that's fine, but you recognize that. It doesn't mean they're a bad person. It just means that that particular thing isn't there. So I think the more that you can invest yourself in networks internally in the university, but also externally in your discipline or field, or, you know, whatever you want to call it, the better the chances of actually hooking up with people who are people you can get on with and who will give you positive reinforcement in that kind of activity. Suzanne.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. And I guess this is a good opportunity to just mention open societal challenges, which we're not actually going to cover, but that's a university fund. And if you want to know more, then just contact me and I will send you in the right direction. But that's a fantastic way of getting some internal funding and making networks, particularly if you want to do larger bids and you want to work with collaborators. It's a way of sort of having time and some money to actually develop those partnerships. I think from a sort of non-specialist, I think the challenges that people face, both at being successful, but also if successful and getting the money, is where partnerships have been hastily put together and you don't actually know and have a good relationship with them, because then you can often find that they don't deliver what they said they would, or there's a lot of difficulties and challenges on actually getting the funding to them. So if you want to develop partnerships, I would really encourage you to spend more time before bidding on looking to develop those partnerships and make sure that you have a really good connection and, where possible, a personal relationship with them. Sometimes it doesn't work that way. You have a relationship with one person and they have the relationship with somebody else, but you've got to trust that first person enough to know that they wouldn't recommend people that aren't going to work well together. And as Simon said, so much with partnership, it's more about the individual connecting and working together than it is that they're the most wonderful organization on paper, because at the end of the day, it's those relationships which enable the project to actually work if you get the funding. So yeah, the two things is take your time and spend time making sure you are happy with who you're going to work with, and also to use that internal funding for that purpose, so you've got a good partnership before you start applying. And I think lots of funders can quite easily see if it's a partnership put in haste and there isn't a real good relationship within that consortium. And now I can't remember, Uma, if you had another question, but just to answer some of the chat things, yes, there is somewhere where you can do some search for funders, and I will demonstrate that at the end, and everybody in the OU has access to that. And I wasn't quite sure if I answered the question on, so generally, if you have been rejected from a funder, there will be either a very specific appeals process or it will only be on technical issues. But if you at the pre-award stage are kind of, oh, I'm not sure if I fit, we have had examples, especially on early career, where maybe somebody is like 3 months over the deadline of 7 years, and we can always talk to the funder for you and just get sort of written feedback whether that's allowed or not allowed. But it's always better to do that before you apply rather than afterwards and discover that you haven't met their criteria. I hope that answers those questions. Uma, do you want to add anything else, or is there any other questions as I'm staring at the chat?
So, well, I can ask a few other questions if it's okay, that I think are useful for, or let's say that these are issues that I've often, that I think are tricky. Let's put it that way. So one thing I know, it is, it's changing now, but there is a requirement for impact in most, most funders ask you to develop impact with your research and to lay out clearly, what shape that impact is going to take. And can you talk us through a little bit more about your experience of that? Again, challenges, what are the pitfalls, let's say, what you would say, are good things to consider? Yeah, a question to the both of you. And of course, still, please, everybody, feel free to ask any questions. I'm just raising questions that in my experience refer to tricky things and can be hopefully useful to colleagues here?
I'm going to say impact is really important, and it's really important not because people say it's important, but because it actually is important. And just, you know, as much as we you know, we do research for its own good, actually we do it because it's good for other people, it's helpful for other people. So for me, my approach has always been, and what I always say to colleagues, is that impact is an intrinsic and essential part of your research proposal. That it's not enough to say, I'm going to do some work and I'm going to understand this thing. How are you then going to take that through to people who are going to find that particularly useful? Now, you know, in my field of UK-EU relations, there's some fairly obvious user groups, you know, and at earlier points, that was the entire UK population or voting population. So, you know, that was an easy kind of thing. But I think it's true, whatever we're doing, that actually we should be thinking about ways in which the work we do allows us to create outputs that are useful for non-academic users as well as for academic colleagues. So don't have, you know, typically you'll get still sort of a section at the end of the application form which is like, talk about your impact, and that's, you know, the temptation is just to talk about it then. But actually you want to pull that all the way through, the design that you have of your research project, the way in which your outputs are produced. That might be about kind of co-development, co-creation with stakeholders. All of that is impact and engagement. And so the sooner you think about that, the better. And I think, you know, just generally thinking about these kinds of activities from the start is really important. And it allows you to then do things more efficiently and more effectively. And also it means that at the end of the project, you know, if you're successful, you've engaged with a whole load of people who are aware of you. And, you know, again, it allows you to draw on more when you make your next application, you know, that people say, oh yeah, you're the person who did the thing with the people that, you know, was actually not kind of sort of, I did it because I was forced to do it, but because it was actually a useful kind of thing. So I think, you know, particularly for us here in social sciences, we have a lot of crossover to different kinds of users, and so definitely we should be doing that. And again, if you're not sure quite how that works in your case, talk to somebody, you know, the research office, research directors. You know, these are people who've got plenty of ideas, and, you know, have seen lots of other people do different kinds of things. So use that, and it's not that you have to produce everything from your brain as if from afresh. It's that, you know, actually you can build on what other people do too.
May I ask Suzanne also to maybe address this, and perhaps Suzanne, you could talk about maybe colleagues' research that you're aware of who may be less, let's say, obviously impactful. So I think Simon was talking about his research about EU-UK relationships, which seems to me to lend itself quite easily to developing impact. But perhaps there are projects that are a little bit more niche, a little bit more specialist perhaps, and where there's a bit more effort required to develop that narrative. And maybe you can give us examples about that. You are muted, Suzanne.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Always more helpful when you have your mic on. So I think the first thing to say is dissemination is not impact. So it can quite be often, I'm going to set up a website and send this things to people, which is not a bad thing, but that isn't impact. Impact is about how you change a group of people. So I think at the start, as Simon said, actually trying to identify, well, what difference could this make and to whom is a good question, because then you can identify your stakeholders or the people that you think it will make a difference to, and then that can inform how you want to do it. So, you know, if they're specialist NGOs, Well, how are you going to actually get hold of those NGOs, and how are you going to engage them so that they can find out about what you're doing? Is a workshop more appropriate to them? So it's worth thinking about it in that way. We're very fortunate in FAST now. We have a team called the Knowledge Exchange and Impact Team. So when writing bids, always go and talk to them, and talk to them very early on in the process, because that's exactly what they're there to do, is to kind of go, well, what do you think you could be doing at the end of this, and who do you think it's useful to? And they can give you lots of tips and directions and show you examples of what other people have done, and also use your colleagues. So people will have done all sorts of things. And again, the impact team are there to kind of go, well, I think this might be useful for museums, but I don't have any contacts in museums. I've never worked with museums before. We can help you find appropriate museums, or put you in contact with people who've worked with museums, to kind of go, well, how do you work with museums? And is this a good way, or isn't this a good way? So examples of maybe less obvious things I can't think off the top of my head, but I think it's that bit at the beginning of, well, who this could, how could this change, and who the people that it could have a difference on. But the knowledge exchange team are really good at kind of going in helping you think that through, because it is a very different skill set, and we don't expect everybody to be able to be experts at impact. So if you have no idea whatsoever, that's fine. Just say, I have no idea, and they will help you think that through. But I think we've got Agnes with her hand up as well. Agnes, you okay to either add, comment, or ask your question?
I just, no, it was, sorry, just a quick addition to what Simon was saying about drawing on people's expertise and on what others have done before. There's a lot of, I mean, I'm not nearly as experienced in bidding as other colleagues in the room, but there are a lot of resources and paragraphs and written things that are kind of standard. More or less standard in every bid. So there's a lot of things that you could source from colleagues or from the research office that you don't have to kind of do yourself. So things like the data management plan, which I was fortunate enough to have a colleague previously lend me hers, and then I based mine largely around hers, and then I lent mine to other people and so on, because it really is a lot of standard text and very standard terminology that you adapt to your project, but you don't have to kind of start from a blank page. Things like OpenLearn, for instance, which a lot of people write into their research projects because it's a great thing that the Open University has that, you know, gives you immediate kind of access to an audience of hundreds of thousands, if not millions. There are standard costings for working with OpenLearn, for depending on the kinds of resources that you want to produce. If you want to produce a short module, or like a taster, or you know, a blog sort of series based on your project, there are standard costings, there are standard language that you can use. The research office or OpenLearn can provide you with numbers of, you know, people who access OpenLearn on a daily basis, so you can write that into your research proposal. So there's a lot of kind of standard things that you can, you know, you can source from other people that can help you kind of put your bid together, so that you don't have to kind of reinvent the wheel every single time. So that was just my addition to that.
Thanks, Agnes. And yes, we definitely have standard documents for, sometimes you need to give some institutional information. Sometimes you have to say about the research environment that you're working in. And for all data management plans, which we would encourage everybody to do, the library actually will provide one-to-one support in writing your data management plan. But also we have examples and formats for supporting letters. Sometimes if you're early career, you need a head of department support letter. And again, we're able to kind of give advice and give some standard text to include or to give examples. So it's always, and then that's why it's really helpful if you can let us know as soon as possible, because that research manager that is there to support you will be able to provide you with all of that information and let you know what we can, and which I'll mention later. We have this library of successful bids, so you can say I want to apply to Leverhulme Fellowship, and we go, oh, here's a successful application. We've obviously got the lead academic's permission, but sometimes it's so much easier to apply having seen how people answer the questions. It's probably a very different research question, but it gives you an idea of the type of things you need to answer under each question. Which, as Simon said, if you can do that succinctly and clearly, it makes the assessor's job easier, which it gives you, it's the same as in a job interview. If you make it easier for the people who are deciding whether you're going to get the interview, it's the same with funders. If you make their job easier and it's clear how you've answered those questions and met the criteria, you're going to be more likely to get higher marks, just because they have so many to look at. Yeah, I hope that answers. Sorry, I was trying to type and listen, but somebody's asked about undergraduate funding. So we generally don't support people who are at the undergraduate level, but I think there is a website for people who want to go on and do different things and want to get funding. So I will have to go and look for that, and I will send it when I send around the PowerPoint as well. So that hopefully will answer that particular question.
Maybe just a very brief comment on that question, because I'm just imagining myself when I was an undergraduate student and really didn't have any idea about how to do this. Maybe just to share a few very basic things. So I think it's really useful to do a master's, to do a postgraduate degree. That's usually very helpful for getting into research. And then, of course, you have to think about whether you want to get into academic research. If that's the case, then it'll be best to, do your master's, think about perhaps finding a job as a research assistant that would entail working on a research project with a more senior academic, and it's their research project, and you're learning the skills of doing research actually on the job. And then later along the line, or straight away, if that's what you wish, doing a PhD, I think would be important. If you're thinking about research that is not in academia, but perhaps for NGOs or perhaps more commercial research, I think it's similar. So it would be good to look for researcher jobs, research assistant jobs in those areas. Right. So just something I thought it might be helpful to start at the very beginning, if that's okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that advice as well.
Yeah.
So I'm very conscious that Simon needs to leave to go and do something else. So just thank you very much, Simon, for your advice and for answering those questions, and all the best with your next.
Yes, well, hopefully the tie is worth it. But just say thank you for questions, and if people have queries about anything I've said, I'm always happy to answer emails, so please just drop me a line, and I hope the rest of the session goes well.
Thank you very much, Simon, for coming and for offering this generously. Thank you.
So just to answer the last question about applicants from outside the OU, so most research institutions will have the equivalent of what we have, which is some support to help them apply directly for their funding. If you're wanting to work with an external organisation and to do something jointly, then again, if you just contact us, and we'll sort of support and help you with that. And again, depending on whether it's a research project, or whether it's actually more about you both working together and knowledge exchange. It might be a different team, but we'll definitely work with you in trying to find appropriate funding for what you want to do with organisations outside of the university, whether they be universities or research institutions or completely different, museums, government non-government organisations, a whole range of stuff. We can support you to look for funders. So if it's okay, I will now go on and talk about some of the funders. But just before I do, Sophie Watson was going to also be able to give some feedback. Unfortunately, she can't make it, but she has been successful with EU funding. So she has very kindly said, if you would like to look at her proposal, she's very happy to share that with anybody who would like to look at an successful EU project. So just to make people aware of that. So if that is something you're interested in, please just email me and I can put you in contact with Sophie about that particular element. So I'm going to go back to trying to share and go. Oops.
Thank you, Suzanne. Yeah, we can see it.
You can see it. Good.
Yeah.
Oops, it's gone all the way back to the beginning. That's not helpful. Oh, okay. So I'm going to spend a bit of time on AHRC, which is the Arts and Humanities Council, and ESRC, which is the Economic and Social Council, because they tend to be the two main funders for sort of the school, well, this kind of area, SSGS. And I'm going to start with AHRC, and the reason for that is they've brought in some new funding. So I don't know if you're going to be able to see this slide terribly well, but we'll get the slide plaque, so it will hopefully you'll be able to see it then. So what the Arts and Humanities Council did was try to listen to feedback from people, and they have now, which I think is a really helpful way of doing it, have basically got 3 pots of funding, and 2 of those pots are new. They haven't given us a lot of details, but hopefully people got an email where I said that they're going to be doing some webinars about these 2 new pots of funding. Us and me and the research managers will be attending the first one of that, so we're as up to date as possible so that we can advise you and help you with that. But you can also obviously attend yourself. If you didn't get that, or if you would like it sent out again, please just do say. So the Arts and AHRC, I'm going to just say that rather than the full name, have now got sort of 3 pots of funding, potentially 4 pots of funding, but I'll talk about the last one. So they've got a new fund between, they said 0, but they realised you cannot apply for 0 money. So from £1 to 100k, which they're calling Curiosity. And that's very much targeted at new bidders, not necessarily early career, but new bidders, or people who really want to test the waters on something quite different, or this will replace the AHRC network bid as well. And it goes up to 100,000, so it's more than what the network bid was, which if anybody is used to AHRC will know what that means. So that's from 0 to 100, and then they've got a catalyst, which is from 100 to 300. And that's generally for people who've had a bit more experience, or they want a bigger group of people to work together, or in fact, it can still involve networking, a bigger network. So at the moment, that's as much detail as we can provide. Hopefully we will get more detail. Their first webinar is on the 5th of July, so we will hopefully be able to give you a bit more detail of that. And then they've got what they already had, which is a research grant, but that's gone up to 1.5 million. It's pretty much the same as it is currently. And they are also talking about much larger bids from more than 1.5 million, but none of that detail has yet come out. And for people who know about AHRC follow-on, which is generally the funding that you do once you've got some AHRC money and you want to do some more impact, then you can apply to the follow-on, and that is staying exactly the same. I will talk about this a bit further, but also to make people aware that UKRI now have are transitioning to a new portal for funding, and these two new pots of money will be using this new portal, but I shall talk about that later. And I will, because it's new, these calls are considered open, but there are they're doing them in batches. So the first batch deadline will close early to mid-October for these two calls. If you miss that batch deadline, that you can just apply exactly the same way the day after that deadline. It just means that it will be reviewed at a later date, so the outcome will be later. And from our understanding of the new system, unfortunately, it means you will have to put the data back into the system all over again. So our advice on that, which I will again go over when we look at the new funding system, is to do all of your workings on a Word document so it becomes easier to cut and paste if for whatever reason you missed the batch deadline, as they're calling them. So that is as much information as we had, which I've sort of gone over, but is there just for you to be able to look at. And links, they will link to the web pages if you wanted more detail or as more detail becomes available. And I just thought it was really useful to know that there's now been a joint statement, and that is a link between the AHRC and ESRC, because there is a recognition that it is not always clear which funder you should go to. So the two councils wish to ensure that there's no application that falls into that gap, so they're trying much harder to have a process which is clear which funder you should go to. So there is recognition of that, and hopefully some way forward. So I'm now going to look at ESRC, but I thought it was helpful to kind of give you an overview. And I must also say all of these slides from now on have come from ARMA virtual tours. So I'm using those slides from those workshops. So in September 2022, UKRI developed a strategy, which was the first strategy it has developed as an overarching organisation. And then each of the funding councils, in a response to that, have developed their own delivery plan. ESRC had a delivery plan to 25, even though the strategy is to 27. Exactly why, we're not sure. We presume so that they can adapt what they're doing. And I won't spend too long on this, but again, it's for reference. So UKR strategy had 6 sort of key areas. So objectives. So each funding council have categorized what they're doing under those 4 objectives. They also have 4 pillars, which are about diversity, connectivity, resilience, and engagement. And then there's also some themes, and ESRC also have themes. So the reason I'm sort of giving you this detail is because with the open calls, there isn't so much a need to refer back to this, but all of the funders are doing quite a lot more specific calls around either a particular theme or an objective. And so when you look at those calls, it's really important that you look at what the detail is in here and you refer back to it. As Simon was saying, that's the kind of the part where you want to make it clear how you fit the criteria of those calls, but those criteria will be based on helping the Funding Council meets one of these objectives. So if you're able to sort of refer to that, that's really will strengthen your bid, because you're demonstrating that you understand how this funding is helping them to meet their objectives. This is also, so the ESRC have these priorities. So digital society, security, risk and resilience, health and social care, net zero environment, biodiversity and climate change. And a lot of their specific calls come out of those. And then there's this sort of underlying understanding behavior, which is kind of meant to link with all of these themes. So it might be less specific calls for that, but in each of those, understanding behavior is key. And that sort of links to the UKRI's strategy out here. So again, if you're responding to a specific call, it's worth mentioning all of those things because it will strengthen your bid. So just a general statement, which is that ESRC are going to have a mixture of these open calls, which is the standard grant and new investigator grant, and a lot more larger but sort of more specific calls through their large grant scheme or centres, which are very large bids, to ensure that they're meeting some of these themes areas. So I'm just going to talk about the two main open calls. So open call is that where it's not about a specific topic or theme. So anybody can apply as long as their topic fits within the ESRC area. And there is a list. But if you're unclear where it needs to fit, either come and talk to us and we can communicate with the ESRC or AHRC to say, does this particular topic, does that fit within your scheme or HR schemes or another funder? So the new investigator grant is aimed at early career. As I said before, ESRC now do not give number of years from your PhD. It's really for you to make clear within your application why you consider yourself to be an early career researcher. And it's up to 300,000. And then this is the main standard grant, which is open. So that means that it doesn't have to fit a theme. It's about your research. It's between 350 and a million. And it can be for one researcher or it can be for a consortium. And there is the two links there if you wanted further information about those funders. So as I said, the UKRI is changing from what has always been the sort of funding a portal called GES to what they're now calling the funding service, TFS, very originally thought up a name. So I have been to one of their sessions. So I'm going to try to give you some detail. It didn't give us a lot of detail, and we will be going to further training sessions, and also we've actually gone into the portal ourselves to try and understand how it works. So the research managers will know as much as they possibly can and will definitely be supporting you through this transition and helping you with how you put things into this new portal. But I think just to draw out again, as I said with AHRC, because this is not a permanent state of affairs, we've been told. So this idea of batching open calls will come to an end either 24 or 25, and it's just to help as we transition into this new portal. So a sort of a real key date is that the first batch deadline for ESRC is the 28th of September. So if you're wanting to do any open calls through the new portal, then if you want it to be assessed in the first batch, you need to have submitted it by the 28th of September. So if you miss that deadline, you can just apply again, but as I said, you will have to re-enter, from our understanding, the data that you put into this application and re-enter into a new application. So the impression we get is that they will sort of wipe all of the applications from the system. And so if you click on to that call, you won't have any of the details that you had prior to that. So that is our understanding. We have yet to see it work, so we can't be 100%. And we were told at our training, if you submit in September, then the likely date for finding out the outcome of that is April 24. And at the latest funding workshop, we were told that the next batch deadline is probably going to be nearer spring rather than early 2024. And they were unclear about how long you will need to wait before the outcome, but the impression was it would be January 25. So for those of you who are experienced and you're thinking about ESR funding, just to bear that in mind when thinking about when you would want to start your projects. They think autumn would be the third round, but they were not certain about any of those dates. The only one which was certain was the 28th of September. So hopefully that gives you some data about what is happening. The application and the portal is very different. It's meant to be much more intuitive. I think it looks, it is easier to navigate, but they're changing quite a lot of their terminology. Part of that is to try and ensure that whether you apply to ESRC or AHRC, the process and the information that you have to give and the way you have to give it is similar, rather than each funding counselling having slightly different rules and different ways of doing things. So there isn't a case of support anymore. They have a vision and an approach to a project instead. And they don't use the terms PI and COI. They lead project lead and I can't remember what they call COI. And the resourcing or the budget is just a straightforward template of staffing and other costs and overheads. So it's very, very broad. There is still the requirement for ethics and data management, but that again is uploaded in a different way. And your justification of resources is much fewer words. So just to sort of, if you are wanting to apply, I would encourage people to start sooner rather than later, because it is quite different and it looks quite different. And I think it might take some more time to kind of work out where you need to put stuff compared to where you would have done it before. And one of the current major disadvantages is that it's only the lead academic who can access the system. So you can't give access to the research managers and you can't give access to any of your co-Is at this point in time. So again, that means that you're required to put in all of the information. So again, just to be aware of that. We get that impression that they are trying very hard to work on that, and come up October, that might be different, but at the moment it is only the lead applicant who can get onto the system and change anything in the portal. So we did EU funding. I'm now going to go on to British Academy, but I'm just kind of, I can't see if there are any questions, so I'm going to ask Uma if she can, is there any questions from people at this point before I move on?
Hi, thank you so much. That was really helpful. So there's one question which I think will be good to address right away, because it relates to the new system. How does it work in relation to external partners? They had to create profiles in GES. Is this still the case here?
So from our understanding, and I must say we've been to one training session and they couldn't actually let us see the actual portal because it didn't work that particular day. you as lead need to go in and put all of that information in. The external or even co-investigators currently can't go onto the system to put any of that in. The information seems to be a lot less what's required for partners, and how we put their staff costings in is also a bit unclear. But as research managers and as a team, we are trying to find out as much as we possibly can about how that will all work. But in some cases, we're going to only learn as we do it, because you have to click on certain tabs and add certain data before something else opens up within the system. So it is going to be very much learn as we go. But hopefully that answered that question as best I can.
Yeah, I think that was a great, super helpful answer. It sounds very difficult actually to do this, but yeah, thank you so much, Suzanne.
Yeah, it is an iterative process where they're adapting as they go, and it is adapting as they go. It's the takeaway from the workshop. Okay, so I now going to look at 3 different funders: the British Academy, Leverhulme, and Wellcome. So there is a lot of slides. I'm not going to look at all of them. They're there because they give you the information so that you've got it when you get passed on these slides. So I will just go over what I think are the main points. So don't worry when you look at the number of slides. So the British Academy, as I said at the beginning, it's always worth looking at what the funder is there for, what is its priorities, and what does it want to achieve. So the British Academy is a very nice funder because it's very broad, deep in understanding of people, societies, cultures, processes and purpose. So it's a very broad funder. It tends to fund people and individual researchers rather than collaborations and complex partnerships. So again, that's there for you to look at, but the funder is generally quite a broad funder, and its areas of interest are really supporting people in their different career paths. And as I said, it tends to, I don't want to give the impression that only, but it's more individual. So it gives more what I call fellowships, which is about giving people time to undertake the research themselves. But there are some international opportunities to bring people in or to work with external people from other countries. There are other funds other than this, but this was an example of how they kind of give funding to different parts of your career. So the postdoc and the BA fellowship tends to be early career or people who haven't done a lot of research. And then that is what it says, mid-career fellowships and senior research fellowships. So it shows the sort of trajectory of starting smaller and getting bigger as your research career progresses. So the British Academy is particularly popular because it has what it's called a small research grant. So this is for awards up to 10,000. So lots of people who haven't applied before use this as a way of being able to start their bidding career. The application process isn't too complicated. It helps you understand how the OU works as well. And it isn't a large amount of money, so it tends to be for the activity you're wanting to do rather than your time, but you can put a little bit of time in. But to make you aware, there's something called now, they use a random allocation process. So because it is very popular, there was a recognition that actually trying to decide if one project should get money over the other project was very difficult. So the random allocation process works in that your application is still assessed by peer reviewers, and it has to meet all the criteria it would have done previously. And I will talk about that a bit later. There's some lists and some hints and tips. And then it goes into a random allocation process. And it is random whether you are then successful. The advantage of this system, having supported some academics through it, is if your application is not considered good enough to go into the random allocation process, you are given some feedback about why that was and how you could improve it. So whether it was good enough or not good enough, you can reapply once. So if it was good enough and you weren't selected, you can pretty much reapply exactly the same, not having to change much. You might need to look at the costings again because it would be a different start date. But in the main, if you didn't get submitted, you can look at the feedback, try and improve the application on that feedback, and then resubmit. It does not have to be to the next round, so you could wait a whole year and then apply. So I just wanted you to be aware of that because it's very popular, and also that it's changed recently and how it assesses. Then there is the postdoc fellowship, and as you see that they say within a set time, which is 3 years, and they give you some detail of what they're looking for. And this slide also shows how successful that is. So as you can see, it's quite a small success rate, but that's, I thought, helpful to have on the slides. Again, the details of how you can apply for this and what this is at the BA fellowship, again, an earlier career option, and it gives you the success rates. So as you can see, they're not high success rates, but it is a way of applying. The bid career, as I said, it's a fellowship, so it's more about funding your time, and it's 6 to 12 months. And this one has 2-stage. So that the British Academy, I think, is one of the helpful funders in that it tries to keep the process simpler if it's for less money, and then it becomes more complicated and more in depth if you're asking for more money. So they do try to make their bidding process appropriate to the amount of money that you're asking for. And that's the success rate. And then the senior, so somebody who's been well established as their researcher, and it tends to, as I said, it's a fellowship, so it tends to be around replacing you and the time you need to do some research. Again, there's the success rate you can look at later, and then there's a range of other things, and I'm not going to go through those because they'll be for reference, but this is definitely worth looking at. Whatever you apply for, this is the general principles. So the British Academy has peer review process. So the excellence of the research, that it's originality, that it's building on what you currently or have been doing or others have been doing. You will see here, it actually says track record of applications. So if you're going for a mid or senior, then having been successful before will strengthen your application, and that it's a realistic research methodology and time allocated to it, and that your outputs are appropriate. So I would say in most cases, that is the criteria used by lots of funders in broad senses. As I said, it's peer reviewed, and so that's. And then I thought these are top tips from the British Academy, but I think are very useful top tips to use whoever you're applying to. So think about who is reading your application, and that is really worth thinking about. So if you're going for UKRI, then it is a peer review process. So it will be read by people who understand your subject. Maybe if it's very niche or detailed, maybe not to the same level, but it will be somebody from your general area. Some funders, it will not be. It will just be general people, or it could be trustees who will know much less about your subject. So therefore, you need to explain a lot more about why you're doing it and how you're doing it, not to presume somebody will understand what terminology you're using or your research method. So it's always worth thinking about who is actually, and you always can find that out from the funder's website, how your application will be assessed and who will be assessing it. I think Simon also said this, write clearly and precisely, and I think most of our academics are brilliant at making clear the enthusiasm they have for the subject, but just that's why the peer review process is helpful, because that people can sort of say, oh, this was unclear, or this didn't really answer that particular question. All funders ask you not to. Sometimes there is very similar questions. Always go to the guidelines to ask, or ask a research manager. These two seem really similar. What are they asking, to make sure that you answer the question they're asking, because again, that can make a big difference on whether you're successful. Yeah, just because there is a word limit, don't necessarily use it. The more precise you can be, the better, because these reviewers all have to read a lot of applications. Avoid jargon or specialism terms which people outside your discipline wouldn't understand if it's not going to be peer reviewed. And don't overcommit, or there's a temptation to kind of say, I'm going to do 1,000 things with £100. Funders and reviewers see through that, and they've looked at enough bids to know what is realistic costings, and it's much better to be realistic with your costings and produce less. So top tips: allocate enough time to prepare, become aware of, so BA use FlexiGrant, which is a different system to UKRI. Always get used to a portal, whatever it is, before you start applying. I think this is a good tip for everybody. Always do whatever for each question, write it in a Word document, because you've then got it saved. It is also easier for co-Is or peer reviewers to make comments on a Word document than it is to ask them to go into a system and have a look. Make sure that you've read the guidelines. Again, our research managers are really good at letting you know what you can and can't apply for, but also the guidelines often say, this is what we're looking for from this question. Share your application, so that is the peer review process. So whether you're required to or not, I would always encourage you to get your application peer reviewed. And again, if you're unclear about anything, ask the research managers. If they can't answer it, they're very happy to contact the funder on your behalf to get clarification on anything. And sometimes, as I said, we've had people who've just fallen outside of a sort of, must be within 2 to 7 years of of your PhD. We have applied to funders and they said, oh yeah, it's 7.5. That's okay, you can still apply. So if you're worried about that, again, just contact us and we can get that confirmation from the funder.